Our topic this week is looking at the impact of racism on educational outcomes and how it tends to perpetuate educational inequality. And this is a very crucial topic because in the US we claim to be an equal opportunity society based on the very fact that we provide equal access to education for all folks, right? So we aren't a socialist nation. The only claim we have to being a meritocracy is to say that everyone in the US has access to public education. But as you notice, some of the readings assigned this week, based on the research of Jonathan Kozol, who has been looking at this and researching these issues. He's been an activist in the field since the 1960s, who's been pointing out these wide inequities within the field of public education. And more recently, we'll also be looking at the research of Linda Darling Hammond, who confirms some of Kozol's findings. So if we were to recap what Jonathan Kozol was talking about, he's saying that race and class play a role in educational outcomes, and these disparities that are based on race and class are a direct result of low spending by the federal government. And Kozol is observing students in schools with the lowest and highest spending per student. His observations display huge disparities, and he concludes that this is largely because education is funded through property taxes. And if we continue to fund education through property taxes, we will never close the gap. We will preserve status quo. Kozol concludes that the disparities that we see in schools constitute what we call de facto segregation. So if you remember the difference between de jure and de facto, you can't have segregation by law after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, but you can continue to have segregation. In fact, we've seen an increase in segregation after the civil rights movement. That is because of the social and economic circumstances that we have. Kozol finds consistently that the way we fund our schools puts students of color at a disadvantage. He says if we want to change things around, we have to have federally guaranteed funding, because in school districts where you have concentrations of poverty, owners that are concentrated in wealthier neighborhoods, and so there's a wide disparity in how much property tax we're able to get, and therefore the per child annual spending is determined by the residential location. He's also very critical of the No Child Left Behind policies that were enacted starting with the Bush administration. And I have a couple of images there that also support this criticism of No Child Left Behind. Some of you have grown through that mandate and encountered that in your own high school careers. And the top one looks at how teachers are not very excited about the No Child Left Behind, making students jump through hoops. What I have heard from teachers is that sometimes you spend an entire month teaching students to the test, and that's not necessarily genuine learning. It's basically learning how to take a test. And the second image here actually shows you a bunch of different animals with different skills and different abilities. Each one pretty valuable, but if you have a standardized exam, which is to climb that tree, right, then of course the folks who have the capacity to climb the tree will do better. And that's not necessarily a fair measure of ability, aptitude, etc. So we will follow up on that discussion when we looked at equity and the difference between equity and equality as well, especially as it applies to education. Covered incarceration in our last module. We looked at the school to prison pipeline, and this time we are focusing more in depth into the institution of education. But I just wanted to remind folks one more time about just again the really lopsided spending that we have on incarceration as compared. Again, you see a concentration of who's in prison, folks with high school or less, and largely Black and Hispanic males. And again, you see like 37% of the incarcerated population is Black, whereas only 12% of the US household population is Black. So that's what we mean by disproportionately impacted. As compared to their percentage in the population, they are overrepresented in the prison population. The figure above looks at prison versus education costs in the US, and it breaks it down by state. If you see, California is pretty high up there. It's number 6 in the rankings in terms of state, in terms of how much expenditure we make per prisoner as compared to per student. And you see a wide gap. In fact, I would say we possibly have the widest gap disparity between how much we spend per prisoner as compared to per student. And this is especially ironic given that a lot of the research shows us that education is the biggest preventative to making sure someone doesn't go to prison or go back into the prison system. And in fact, folks show that already within associates, your recidivism rates drop dramatically. And then, of course, if you go on to a bachelor's, drops further. If you get a master's, recidivism drops to 0, right? That's the rate of going back into the prison system. Here, if you isolate numbers just for California, we spend 48,000. These numbers are already about a decade old. 48,000 per inmate, right? And 7,400 per college student. Re-incarceration rates or recidivism rates are the worst in all 50 states, right? So in California, we are very aware of the urgency of these issues. And at DVC, we've had presentations in the past by Barrios Unidos who go more in depth into that. And we set up a mock prison in our commons just to give folks a sense of what a prison cell is like. I have some excerpts from Kozol here. He's again pointing out that disparity in spending in wealthier school districts. This is from 1987. And so that gap has only increased in terms of how much we spend in wealthier school districts versus underprivileged school districts. And the story was the same throughout the country. Per capita spending for poorer students and students of color in urban areas was a fraction of that in richer, whiter suburbs just miles away. And you have some examples of that in the additional sources, right? So there's a clip from Oprah which will show you just like two schools 1 hour away from each other are radically different sources they offer to their students. And I want to emphasize that there's nothing natural about suburban, right? It's not that, oh, you just got lucky in a particular neighborhood. This is a direct product of federal policy making, right? Folks who are deciding where the highways will be built, What's going to happen to our urban renewal? Are we going to support racially homogeneous enclaves, right? That's why I keep emphasizing that looking at history is so important if you want to understand these issues, and then also looking at the connection between different institutions such as housing and health and education and criminal justice system. The image at the top is showing you that gerrymandering is actively used to create school districts, and of course it is often very political. It can be used to reduce the impact of residential segregation, but often it recreates residential segregation or makes it worse, right? So you see a lot of parent lobby groups, middle class, upper middle class parents who actually want this kind of segregation to continue. And it shows up in city hall meetings and all of that. That, hey, I spend money to buy a home in this neighborhood so that my kid can go to school with the right kind of kids, right? The notion that neighborhood schools are somehow innocent of government power is patently false, right? So in northern cities, Kozol finds that school district authorities willfully gerrymander, right? Where the schools naturally would have yielded integration, they actually prevented that integration. And so when you think of this residential segregation, Kozol saying we are more segregated today than we were in the 50s because of residential segregation. Our schools are segregated. There were some policies implemented to mitigate that. One is busing children from underprivileged neighborhoods to wealthier school districts. Pros and cons of busing, of course, you're getting theoretically better access to resources and so on, but the burden is often on communities of color, underprivileged neighborhoods where you have sometimes elementary school kids traveling a whole hour to get to a better school. Right? And of course, these kids are often stigmatized. Some have been called the ghetto kids. Parents are mad about them. Hey, they'll bring our school ranking down, etc., etc. So they're not necessarily welcomed. And the other thing that goes with busing is tracking, where children are tracked into different ability levels. And even though the idea behind tracking is that you have some kids who need to catch up because they hadn't had those resources before, unfortunately, the research shows us that folks who are kind of concentrated into lower tracks early on very rarely make it to the higher tracks, which is the college level, AP classes, and so on. And with each year, the quality of education they receive in those lower tracks is much poorer. And those lower tracks are also stigmatized. So essentially, you have schools within schools, right? Sometimes the Boston kids are not even eating lunch at the same time as the other kids. And you're recreating again those conditions for these kids to fail, essentially. Linda Darling Hammond also presents some evidence of unequal opportunity. In fact, her whole essay is arguing forget affirmative action. Let's just talk about making opportunity equal, right? Let's just first do what we claim in our Constitution, right? Which is equal access, which she demonstrates pretty effectively doesn't exist right now, right? And I thought it was very interesting to look at the OECD countries, which is essentially the developed nations in the world. And you find that if you just isolate by white, right, if you disaggregate by white, you see that the US is doing pretty well. You disaggregate simply by Asian, you see that we're, more advanced than a lot of OECD nations, but then you get to Black